I never thought a fire could follow you. Not in the way you carry its memory. The scent of smoke tucked into your hair and clothes, the heat lingering in the corners of your mind. But Cougar Camp, in the shadows of the Washington Cascades, taught me differently. I didn't arrive expecting anything but quiet, a chance to park my RV, breathe forest air, and shake loose the tension I carried from the city. My name is Jared, and I usually camp with friends, but this time it was just me and my niece, Ellie. She's 14, sharp, fearless in ways I envy, but too young to understand the kind of danger a place like this can hold. We pulled into Cougar Camp in mid-afternoon, the sun already low enough that the western slopes threw long, stretching shadows over the dirt road. The campground was nearly empty, only a handful of RVs scattered across the loops, their owners tucked behind curtains or in their rigs, oblivious to one another. The air was thick with the scent of pine, wet earth, and something else, something acrid I couldn't place. It hung low, like the forest itself had exhaled smoke just before our arrival. I backed our rig into a spot near the edge of the clearing, just close enough to the tree line that Ellie could wander a little without me losing sight entirely. Her backpack was already out, and she was bouncing on her heels, eager to explore. I told her to stick to the path, that the woods were easy to get lost in this late in the season, but as usual, she smiled like rules didn't apply to her and disappeared before I finished the sentence. I sighed and started unhitching the generator, my fingers brushing the rough metal with a kind of practiced detachment. It wasn't until the sun began to slip behind the mountains that I noticed the first oddity. A thin wisp of smoke curled above the tree line, far enough away that it could have been a distant campfire, or a forest fire already claiming its first victims. I frowned. There was no one out there. Cougar Camp wasn't a bustling hub in October. Most of the summer campers were gone, and yet that scent lingered, faintly sweet and chokingly sharp at the same time, clinging to my nostrils like it had always been a part of the air here. Ellie came running back just as I set up the small fire pit near our RV. "Jared, look," she called. "Someone's out there." She pointed toward a clearing across a bend in the trail. I squinted, trying to catch whatever she'd seen. All I could make out was a shimmer through the trees, the kind sunlight throws when it hits a wet surface. A mist, maybe, or the reflection of smoke. "Probably just another camper," I said, but my voice lacked conviction. We hadn't seen anyone for at least half an hour. The woods were too quiet, almost expectant. I felt it then, that subtle tug of unease that only comes when you know, deep down, something isn't right. By nightfall, the campground had transformed. The shadows pooled in corners, and the rustling of leaves sounded like whispers, like someone was tracing our path just beyond the edge of the light. I built our fire cautiously, making sure the logs were stacked so that the glow reached every angle around our RV. Ellie sat on the fold-out chair, her legs tucked under her chin, eyes wide as she listened to the sounds of the forest. "Do you hear that?" she whispered. I froze. There it was again, soft, deliberate, a scraping noise like claws on bark. It came from somewhere behind the tree line. My first instinct was to tell her it was a raccoon or a deer or some animal minding its business. But the sound carried an odd rhythm, almost human, and it didn't fit the ordinary life of the forest. "I'll check it out," I said, trying to steady my voice. I grabbed the flashlight and stepped beyond the ring of firelight, careful not to leave Ellie completely in the dark. The beam cut through the trees, revealing trunks slick with evening dew, but nothing moved. No raccoon, no deer, not even a bird flitting away from the path. Just the smoke. Faint, curling, and impossibly close now, even though I knew there was no fire near enough to make it. I turned back to see Ellie staring at me, her small hand clutching the chair's edge like she feared I might vanish into the shadows. I felt the weight of that fear, not just her own, but mine too, the kind that sits behind your eyes and makes you question the harmlessness of a place you thought you knew. We ate dinner silently. I tried to convince myself the smell of smoke was nothing. The scratching sounds just the forest settling, the leaves rubbing together in windless cold. But then came the first scream. Not far, closer than anything should be in an empty campground. High, sharp, and broken, it sliced through the night and froze my chest in a way that made my heartbeat thunder. Ellie shrank against me, and for a long moment neither of us moved, both of us listening, both of us too afraid to even breathe. I grabbed a second flashlight and stepped outside again, moving toward the sound. The trees seemed to press closer with each step, and the forest floor had that damp sponge-like texture that made each footfall uncertain. And then I saw it. Ashes. Not from a campfire, not from anything I'd burned, but a small patch of blackened gray dust at the base of a cedar. It was fresh, smoldering lightly, and the smell was unbearable, burnt pine, human hair, and something I could only describe as sulfuric. Ellie gasped behind me. Who did that? She whispered. I didn't answer because I didn't know. My mind raced, trying to rationalize, trying to convince myself someone was playing a prank. But the forest was silent except for that faint, oppressive smoke curling up like a warning. I grabbed her hand. We're leaving, I said. She didn't argue, which was unusual. She only clutched my arm, staring at the ashes as if they were some living thing. I felt the urgency, too, the way your instincts flare when something you can't see is already aware of you. As we climbed back into the RV, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone, that every shadow held a waiting presence. I started the engine, and the glow of the dashboard felt like a fragile barrier against whatever was out there. We drove slowly, eyes darting to the forest edge, ears straining for any hint of movement. But the smoke followed, thin and insistent, curling around the wheels like the forest itself had reached for us. When we finally made it to the main road, the smell lingered still. Not just smoke, but that acrid, choking warning that comes from something older, something that had burned before and was waiting to burn again. I realized then, in the quiet hum of the RV engine, that Cougar Camp wasn't a place you simply left. It clung to you. The ashes of its history burned into your mind long after you thought you'd escaped. That night, I couldn't sleep. The memories of those ashes, the scraping noises, the smell that seemed to seep into the mattress, pressed against me. Ellie whispered in her sleep, restless, and I realized she'd carried her own terror silently through the RV ride. I tried to reason with myself, told myself it was just the forest, just the wind, just a prank. But deep down, I knew better. In the morning, the campground seemed innocent, even cheerful in the light of day. Sunlight fell across the empty loops, birds called, and the distant mountains were serene and indifferent. I debated whether to stay Benisa to chalk it up to imagination or to leave and never return. But then I found another patch of ashes, small, cold, and deliberate, just beyond the tree line near our rig. It was a warning. Not just of fire, not just of the forest, but of the weight of history that Cougar Camp carries. And as we packed, I knew that some lessons aren't learned through logic, through explanation, or through careful observation. Some lessons come through fear, through the quiet insistence that some places hold memories that will not let you go. I looked at Ellie, brushing a strand of hair from her face, and saw her own unease reflected in the curve of her mouth, in the tightness of her hands. I wanted to reassure her, to tell her we were safe, but I couldn't, because the truth was, the fire wasn't done with us. It would follow, in memory, in fear, in the restless, lingering ashes that marked the edges of Cougar Camp. And I knew then that the safest lesson I could teach her was the one I had learned myself. Respect the forest, respect its history, and never ignore the small warnings that smoke and shadow and silence leave behind. By the time we reached the highway, the morning fog had thickened, curling like ghostly fingers along the shoulders of the road. I kept my eyes on the asphalt, even though part of me wanted to glance back at the dark wall of trees we'd left behind. Ellie was quiet, curled against the seat, her backpack half slid from her lap to the floor. Normally, she would chatter endlessly, pointing out every crow or squirrel or oddly shaped cloud. Not today. Not after Cougar Camp. We drove without speaking, the hum of the RV engine a fragile shield against the echo of what we'd seen. But every time the fog thickened or a shadow slid across the road, my heart jolted, and I felt it again. That lingering pull from the ashes, the subtle insistence of a fire that burned in memory more than in reality. We decided to stop at a small roadside diner about 20 miles down the highway. It was the kind of place where locals still kept glass jars of pickles on the counter, and the smell of frying bacon made you forget the world outside for a moment. I ordered coffee strong enough to steady my hands, and Ellie picked a stack of pancakes bigger than her plate. She didn't eat much, though, pushing forkfuls around as if the syrup held some invisible threat. "Do you think it followed us?" she asked quietly, almost too quietly. I swallowed hard. "No," I said, though the words felt empty even as they left my mouth. I wanted to reassure her. I wanted to believe it myself. But the memory of the ashes, the scraping noise in the trees, the acrid smell clinging to my clothes, it didn't vanish with daylight. By afternoon, the fog had lifted, and the highway opened to rolling hills and dense forest that still felt eerily familiar. Ellie dozed against my shoulder, but I couldn't sleep. My thoughts kept drifting back to the ashes, the subtle rhythm of the scratches, the way the smoke seemed to reach even when I thought we were safe. I found myself scanning the forest edges again, imagining shadows slipping between trees, listening for a sound I wasn't sure I wanted to hear. As we drove, I recalled something a ranger in Oregon had once told me about the Cascades, that the forests here remember. Not like people do, not in a conscious way, but in the way the wind shifts, the way the underbrush settles, the way fire and flood leave marks that last for decades. Places like Cougar Camp carry that memory in their soil, in their trees, in the scent of burned pine that hangs stubbornly in the air. I hadn't understood it fully until now. That night, we camped at another spot, a small RV park closer to a river. It was far more ordinary, well-lit, and filled with the hum of other campers settling in for the evening. I should have felt safe. I should have slept. But every time I closed my eyes, I felt the ashes crunch under my feet, smelled smoke curling in my hair, and heard that slow, deliberate scraping in the trees. I woke to movement outside. My eyes snapped open, and for a split second, I saw a figure near our RV, a shadow among shadows. Heart racing, I grabbed the flashlight and swung the beam toward the noise. Nothing. The bushes were still. The river rippled faintly in the moonlight. My chest heaved, adrenaline buzzing in my veins. Ellie stirred, murmuring something incoherent in sleep. I tried to convince myself it was imagination. The mind plays tricks after fear like that. After all, we'd left Cougar Camp hours ago. We were nowhere near it now. And yet, the smell lingered faintly, as if the forest had tagged along, whispering from somewhere unseen. The next morning, I decided we needed a distraction, something to shake the memory loose before it hardened into a permanent mark. I told Ellie we'd hike a short trail near the river, something easy, picturesque, and unthreatening. She perked up immediately, the first sign of her usual self in 2 days. As we walked, the forest felt normal, almost cheerful. Birds chirped, leaves shimmered in the morning light, and the trail was wide and forgiving. I let myself relax just a little, thinking maybe, just maybe, we'd escape the shadow of Cougar Camp. And then we found the first footprint. It wasn't large, but it was deliberate, too deliberate to be an animal. The mud was soft enough to hold a shape, and there was an odd heat radiating from it, subtle but undeniable. I bent down, brushing the soil carefully with my fingers. It was warm, almost smoldering, as if whatever had made it had been there very recently. My stomach dropped. Ellie noticed my expression and frowned. "Jared, is that?" I shook my head. "I don't know. Stay close." We continued, but the trail seemed to conspire against us. Branches shifted without wind, birds fell silent, and the soft crunch of the mud beneath my boots became louder, echoing in a way that felt orchestrated. Every few steps, I thought I saw smoke curling between the trees, faint, teasing, impossible. It was maddening, the kind of fear that doesn't scream at you but presses gently, insistent, unrelenting. By midday, we reached a clearing near a waterfall. The sun danced on the water, and for a fleeting moment I let myself breathe. But the relief was brief. Ashes. A small patch, blackened and scattered near the bank, almost hidden by moss. My stomach clenched. Not a campfire, not anything ordinary, just deliberate, smoldering reminders that we weren't as far away as I'd hoped. Ellie clutched my arm. Why are they following us? I didn't answer. I couldn't. I only knew that Cougar Camp had imprinted something on us, something that didn't respect distance or reason. The forest was a living memory, and we were part of it now, unwillingly bound to a fire that had burned before us and would burn again. We returned to the RV in tense silence. I double-checked the locks, the windows, even the electrical hookups. Rationally, I knew it was unlikely anyone or anything could follow us here. But fear doesn't adhere to rational thought. It festers in corners, whispers in shadows, and clings like smoke. That night, I dreamed of fire, not distant, not a city blaze, but the small, deliberate kind, like ashes scattered across the forest floor. I saw silhouettes in the smoke, shapes that weren't human yet moved with intention. I woke sweating, the dream lingering in my mind like a warning. Ellie was awake too, staring at the ceiling. "They're coming back," she whispered. I held her close, pressing the weight of my own disbelief into silence. By morning, I realized we couldn't linger any longer. Cougar Camp had changed something inside me, something deep and unshakable. The ashes weren't just a warning, they were a lesson. Respect the forest, yes, but also respect the history it carries, the unspoken dangers that sleep beneath pine needles and behind shadows. We packed quickly, the RV silent except for the engine and the occasional creak of a door. I glanced at Ellie. She was pale, her small hands gripping her seat tightly. I wanted to promise her safety, but the truth was, the forest had already marked us, and I couldn't lie. I could only drive, only keep moving, only hope that distance might dull the memory. As we left the small river campground behind, I looked back once into the thick green where the trees met the sky. The smoke wasn't there, the ashes weren't visible, and yet I felt their weight. Cougar Camp wasn't just a place, it was a warning, a living memory of fire that refused to die, and I knew we carried it with us. Quietly, insidiously, until the end of our days. We drove for hours, the Cascades shrinking behind us, their shadows replaced by rolling hills and highway signs that promised civilization. Yet every time I glanced at Ellie, I saw the same tension mirrored in her eyes, the same fear I felt coiled tight in my chest. I tried to keep conversation light, pointing out farms, the occasional deer, signs for diners and gas stations, but it was hollow. Words can't compete with the memory of smoke curling at your feet or ashes smoldering in places no fire should reach. By late afternoon, we pulled into a larger RV park on the outskirts of a small town. It was orderly, bright, filled with laughing families and the distant clatter of children on playground equipment. For the first time in 2 days, I allowed myself to believe we could rest, that the shadow of Cougar Camp might finally release us. I watched Ellie step down from the rig, her knees wobbling but steady. We chose a spot at the far end, nearest the woods but far enough that the bright park lights might keep the night benign. I set up our campfire carefully, smaller this time, controllable, the flames a soft glow. Ellie helped, stacking logs, watching me with that cautious curiosity she had regained slowly over the last hour. Night fell, and for a moment it felt ordinary. Crickets chirped, a distant dog barked, and the occasional car rolled past on the nearby road. I thought maybe we'd outrun the fear, outrun Cougar Camp's memory. Maybe the forest's fire had finally stayed behind. Then came the smell. Not faint this time. Not teasing. It hit me in the nose with that same acrid bite, the faint sweetness of burned wood, the unmistakable warning. My stomach knotted, and I felt the hair on my arms rise. Ellie stiffened next to me. It's smoke," she whispered. I nodded, though my throat was tight. "Yeah, but we didn't start a fire. Not out here. Nothing's burning." The sound followed almost immediately. Soft, deliberate scratching, rhythmical, deliberate, moving from the tree line toward our small campsite. I stood slowly, flashlight in hand, trying to pierce the darkness. The trees swayed, but the wind was still. Leaves rustled under invisible feet. Every instinct screamed for me to run, but I stayed, the need to protect Ellie anchoring me in place. We watched as a thin ribbon of smoke rose just beyond the RV, curling like a finger beckoning us. Then came the ashes, drifting gently down as if carried on invisible wind, landing near our fire pit. I dropped to my knees, inspecting them, heart hammering. These weren't remnants of anything natural. They were deliberate, cold, yet fresh, a warning that history had not yet finished its lesson. Ellie gripped my arm, her small hands trembling. "Jared, what do we do?" I took a deep breath, forcing my mind into calm. Fear could paralyze you, or it could sharpen you. I chose the latter. "We leave," I said firmly. "Now." We jumped into the RV, sealing doors and windows, starting the engine as quickly as we could. The forest pressed close, shadows sliding toward us from every side. The smoke followed, creeping along the ground like living fingers, curling around the wheels and clinging to the edges of the rig. The sound of scratching, soft, deliberate, patient, echoed in my ears. It was as if Cougar Camp itself had sent a message. Distance does not equal safety. The road stretched out before us, winding through dark hills and moonlit valleys. Every mile I thought might break the spell. The smell and the memory pressed closer, heavier. Ellie leaned against me, silent, eyes wide, and I realized she was carrying her own burden now, a fear I could neither explain nor erase. We reached a town by midnight, lights spilling onto asphalt and rooftops. I found a motel, simple, unremarkable, but far enough from any forest to feel temporary relief. I parked, leaving the engine running for comfort, and let Ellie crawl into bed, pulling the covers tight. I stayed awake, staring out the window, listening for the whispers of ash and smoke that no longer made sense in the town's sterile light. Sleep came fitfully, filled with dreams of fire, shadows, and voices I couldn't place. I woke before dawn, the first fragile threads of sunlight cutting through the blinds. Ellie was asleep, peaceful this time, and I realized something crucial. The forest might follow you in memory, might linger in smell and sound, but you carry it alive inside you, not outside. Cougar Camp hadn't touched us physically, but it had marked us. Its lesson would remain. I spent the morning reflecting, the fear settling into something quieter, a constant hum rather than a scream. It occurred to me that this was why people respect the forests in the Cascades, why old-timers warned against lingering too long or ignoring the signs. Fear isn't just about danger, it's about attention. It's about learning to see, to listen, to acknowledge the weight of history that the trees, the soil, the smoke carries in silence. I spoke with Ellie gently, trying to untangle her terror from mine. "Do you remember the ashes?" I asked. She nodded slowly. "I don't want them to follow me again," she said softly. "They won't," I said, because I had to believe it. And yet, deep down, I knew it was only partially true. The ashes follow in memory, in instinct, in the quiet part of you that listens when the forest speaks. What we could do was respect it, carry the lesson forward, and not ignore the subtle warnings that had nearly cost us both more than we understood. We stayed in that motel for 2 nights, trying to recalibrate, trying to convince ourselves the fire, the smoke, the shadow of Cougar Camp was behind us. But when we finally packed the RV again, heading east toward open plains where the trees were less dense, the lesson stayed. I smelled the faintest trace of pine smoke in my clothes, the kind that clings despite washing. And I realized that some fear is a teacher, relentless and uncompromising, leaving marks that are invisible but indelible. Driving through the mountains, I thought about the other campers, the strangers we might meet, the families who would enter Cougar Camp without understanding. I thought about how easily we rationalize, how quickly we dismiss warning signs in favor of comfort or familiarity. And I promised myself in that quiet morning light that I would not forget. Not the ashes, not the scraping, not the smell that clung to the back of my mind like a lesson burned into memory. Ellie leaned against me once more as the highway stretched forward. She was quieter now, thoughtful, still processing the fear we'd faced together. I reached over and squeezed her shoulder. We're safe now, I said, not because the forest had released us, but because we had learned to respect it, to understand the fire that burns in memory and carries forward. That was the kind of safety worth having, the kind built on attention, respect, and awareness. As the Cascades disappeared behind us entirely, I knew that the story of Cougar Camp wouldn't leave us. It had burned itself into our instincts, a reminder that fear, when respected, can save you. And as the miles stretched forward into unknown forests, open plains, and the promise of other adventures, I felt something profound, a quiet strength, forged in smoke and shadow, carried forward by ashes, by memory, by survival. We would camp again, yes. We would explore forests, rivers, mountains, but we would carry the lesson of Cougar Camp with us, subtle, insistent, alive. Respect the fire, respect the forest, and never underestimate the power of history waiting quietly among the trees. And in that quiet knowledge, I found the strange, enduring comfort of survival. Not triumph, not conquest, but awareness. The kind that changes you, shapes you, and leaves you humbly aware that some things are bigger than you, older than you, and wiser than you can imagine. Some fears, if acknowledged, are gifts. Ellie stirred, smiled faintly, and said, almost to herself, I think I'm ready. And for the first time in days, I believed her. I'll never forget the first time I heard someone whisper that question around a fire. The way the sparks floated up like nervous spirits into the night. My name is Daniel Hayes. I'm 42 years old, and I've been living on the road in my RV for nearly a decade now. Some folks think I do it to chase freedom, others believe it's because I'm running from something. Maybe both are true, but if there's one thing this lifestyle has taught me, it's that the line between a peaceful campground and a place you should never step foot in can be thin, fragile, and invisible until it's already too late. I grew up in Kansas, a landlocked kid with nothing but flat horizons and a constant itch to see mountains, deserts, forests, the wild edges of America. When I finally bought my RV, a battered Winnebago with faded paint and squeaky brakes, I felt like I'd been handed a key to the secret rooms of this country. But as I crossed those back roads, as I parked in the shadows of red rock canyons, beneath towering pines, on forgotten dirt pull-offs where the stars drowned out the sky, I started hearing stories, real stories. The kind that made you wonder if freedom always came with a price. One night in Montana, at a campground outside of Glacier National Park, I sat with a local couple who told me about a missing RVer. They said the man had been parked just 3 spots down from where I was sitting. His fire burned low into the night, the smoke curling into the crisp alpine air, and then he was gone. No signs of a struggle, no broken branches, no tire tracks leaving early. Just gone. His RV door left wide open, his dog sitting at the step, whining into the dark. At first, I wanted to chalk it up to rumor. People vanish in national parks all the time. Maybe he wandered off, maybe he chose to disappear. But when you live this life long enough, you notice the patterns. You hear the same stories told in different accents, states away. Dogs barking at nothing, fires that never go out. Doors swinging open in the wind when there is no wind. And you start to wonder, are these warnings or are they legends designed to keep us sharp? That night, I couldn't sleep. The forest pressed against the thin aluminum walls of my RV like a living thing, the smell of pine sharp and suffocating. I heard a creak outside, footsteps too heavy for a deer, too deliberate for the wind. My breath slowed, my chest tightened. I wanted to believe it was just another camper walking back from the bathroom, but deep down I knew there was no bathroom that way. I sat up in my bunk and listened, and there it was, the sound of a low, drawn-out whistle, the kind a person makes when they're signaling. It rose and fell like it was searching for an answer, but no answer ever came. My mind raced. Who whistles in the dead of night, alone in the woods? My instinct told me not to move, not to even breathe too loudly. And for the first time since I'd started this journey, I realized how vulnerable an RV really is. Thin walls, a single locked door, a world of glass windows. The next morning, I forced myself to step outside. The ground was damp with dew, the sun just cresting the ridge. I looked for footprints, tire marks, anything. But the earth was clean, almost too clean, like something had pressed flat the evidence of the night. And when I asked around, no one else had heard a whistle. No one else had seen a thing. That's when the doubt started to creep in. Had my imagination gotten the best of me? Or had something decided I wasn't worth answering yet? It's moments like that which make you reconsider every story you've ever heard. Later that summer, down in Utah near Canyonlands, I met a young couple, Mark and Alina, both in their late 20s, who swore they'd encountered something in the desert that stalked them for 3 nights straight. They were parked at a primitive site, no hookups, just a wide stretch of slick rock under a glowing sky. On the first night, they heard scratching at the tires. They thought it was wind. On the second night, their propane stove clicked on by itself inside the RV, even though the knobs were off. On the third night, Elena told me, they woke to find the windows fogged from the outside, as if someone or something had been breathing against the glass. Mark laughed when he told it, said maybe they were just paranoid. But Elena didn't laugh. She leaned forward across that folding picnic table, her eyes fixed on mine, and whispered, "It wanted us to leave, and when we did, it stopped." You don't forget a face like that. So are these dangerous RV stories really true? Or are they the campfire inventions of restless travelers, designed to spice up a lifestyle that can sometimes be lonely and monotonous? I've asked myself that question too many times to count, and yet, when the sun dips behind the trees, when the wind pushes against the awning, when you hear a branch snap where no branch should snap, you don't care whether the stories are true. You feel them breathing down your neck. I'll tell you about one more place. Arizona, late fall. I had been driving for hours across a flat, endless desert, the kind where the sky feels heavy, pressing down like it wants to crush you. I pulled into an RV park that barely deserved the name, a gravel lot with a faded sign that said, "Welcome Travelers." There were only 2 other rigs there, both old, both silent. The office was locked, no host in sight. I should have kept driving, but I was tired, and something about the silence felt almost staged, like the desert was waiting to see if I'd choose to stay. That night, I woke at exactly 3:17 a.m. My watch glowed on the side table, the only light in the RV. I didn't wake because of a dream or because of thirst. I woke because of a smell. It was faint at first, like wet earth, like a garden left too long without sun. But then it thickened, seeping through the vents until I could taste it on my tongue. I sat up, heart hammering, and checked the stove, the fridge, everything. Nothing. But when I opened the blinds, I froze. The other 2 RVs, both of them, were gone. Just vanished. No headlights leaving, no engines starting. One moment there, the next moment gone. The gravel lot stretched out under the moonlight, smooth as if no tires had ever cut across it. I blinked, rubbed my eyes, told myself maybe I'd parked in a dream. But then I saw it. One chair, sitting in the middle of the lot. A folding chair. And on the seat, a lantern glowing with no one around to light it. I didn't move for an hour. Just sat there staring out, my breath fogging the glass. And then, without a sound, the lantern went out. People ask me why I keep traveling, why I keep parking in these places, why I don't just settle in some quiet RV community where the strangest thing you'll hear at night is the hum of an air conditioner. And I don't know how to answer without sounding crazy. Maybe it's because I believe these stories, and maybe it's because I don't. But either way, I can't shake the feeling that the only way to know the truth is to keep moving, keep listening, keep testing the line between myth and reality. Because out here on the road, under the endless American sky, the question isn't whether the dangerous RV stories are true. The question is, when it's your turn to become one of them, will you recognize the signs before it's too late? The truth is, once you've heard enough of these stories, you begin carrying them with you. They settle into the cracks of your mind like grit in a window frame, rattling every time the wind picks up. And no matter how much you tell yourself they're just tales, they find ways to remind you. This life on the road isn't just about freedom. It's about risk. Sometimes the risk is weather, sometimes it's mechanical failure, and sometimes it's something far less tangible, something that makes you wonder whether the land itself remembers more than we do. Take the time I parked along the Ouachita Mountains in Arkansas. I'd pulled off to a remote campground tucked between steep ridges, the kind of place where radio dies and the world feels untouched. The host was an old man with a white beard, skin browned by decades of sun, who shuffled out of a wooden shack with a lantern swinging in his hand. He told me he didn't recommend camping past the second loop. Too quiet, he said. Too dark. I laughed it off, thought he was warning me about bears. But as I rolled into that second loop, I realized how quickly sound disappears in certain pockets of the world. My footsteps on the gravel seemed swallowed whole. Even the crickets, normally a steady chorus in the south, fell mute. That night, as I lay in my bunk, I heard tapping, not the skittering of small animals, not the random falling of acorns, but rhythmic tapping. 3 knocks, pause, 3 more knocks, pause, again and again. I froze, sweat slicking my palms. At first, I thought it came from the door, but the sound shifted, circling the RV like someone running their fingers along the metal siding. The air inside felt suddenly thin, like breathing through wet cloth. My mind screamed at me to grab a flashlight, to open the blinds, to prove it was nothing. But something deeper, something primal, whispered, "Don't." When morning came, there were no footprints, no marks, nothing. I drove out fast, gravel spitting behind me. At the exit, I passed the old host again. He didn't smile, didn't wave, just watched me with those tired eyes like he'd seen 100 people drive out the same way, white-knuckled and shaken. It makes you wonder, doesn't it? Maybe some places don't want company. Maybe they remind you in ways only the body can feel, ways the mind struggles to rationalize. Of course, not all stories are whispered in the dark. Some shout at you in daylight, bold as anything. I remember a stretch in Nevada, a desolate RV park outside Ely. Only a handful of rigs were scattered across the dust, and the air shimmered with heat. I was talking to a woman named Grace, mid-50s, solo traveler, the kind who carried pepper spray on her belt and eyes sharp from years of solitude. She leaned close and told me something I'll never forget. When you're in the desert long enough, the land starts to move. Not in earthquakes, but in illusions. And if you don't look twice, you'll follow them right into nowhere. That night, I sat outside my RV, beer in hand, staring at the horizon. The desert was flat, endless, a painted backdrop of ochre and violet. And then I saw it. Headlights, far off, approaching slow. Relief washed through me. Someone else was arriving. But as the lights neared, I noticed they didn't rise or dip, didn't sway the way headlights should on a rough road. They just glided, steady, too steady. And then, without warning, they blinked out. The desert swallowed them whole. No sound of an engine, no dust trail, nothing. Grace walked up beside me, arms folded. "Told you," she said. "It's not the first time, won't be the last." I couldn't sleep after that. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those phantom headlights, and I thought about how many RVers before me might have chased them, thinking they were following a road or a convoy, only to vanish into the desert night. And still, people ask, are these stories real? I can't give you a simple yes or no. What I can tell you is how they feel. Because when you're out there, miles from help, your senses sharpen. Every creak of the RV feels loaded. Every gust of wind carries weight. The mind plays tricks, sure, but sometimes the tricks leave fingerprints, and sometimes those fingerprints don't fade. Take Colorado, for instance. A friend of mine, Patrick, camped in the Rockies one autumn. He parked near a frozen lake, the kind that mirrors the mountains so perfectly you can't tell where the land ends and the sky begins. That night, he said he heard footsteps crunching in the snow around his RV. Slow, deliberate. He figured it was elk, or maybe another camper. But when he peeked out, he saw nothing, just his own RV reflected in the glassy lake. Except the reflection wasn't perfect. He swears he saw a figure in the reflection, standing behind his rig, motionless, a tall, thin shape like a person waiting. But when he turned to look, nothing, just the sound of his breath fogging against the cold. He left at dawn, refusing to stay another night, and to this day he won't camp near water, says Reflections Lie. I don't share this to scare people off RV life, quite the opposite. The road has given me more beauty, more freedom, more lessons than anything else ever could. But I also believe it's dishonest to ignore the darker corners of the lifestyle. We tell ourselves these tales, not just for entertainment, but as warnings, as coded wisdom passed between travelers. Because what's scarier, the thought that all these stories are real, or the possibility that in the middle of the night, when your RV rocks and the silence hums with pressure, you'll be the one who discovers they are. That's the tightrope we walk out here. We balance between skepticism and instinct, between laughter around the fire and the cold sweat at 3 a.m. You don't have to believe in ghosts or in phantom lights or in reflections that don't match. But you'd be a fool not to respect the power of isolation, the frailty of human senses, and the truth that nature doesn't bend to our comfort. The stories don't stop. They keep circling back, whispered at roadside diners, scribbled in campground journals, murmured between strangers who might never meet again. And when you piece them together, when you notice the echoes, the repetitions, the missing camper in Montana, the phantom breath in Utah, the lantern in Arizona, the tapping in Arkansas, you realize it's not about whether they're true. It's about whether they carry enough truth to keep you alive. Because when the sun sets and the world goes dark, the difference between legend and reality doesn't matter nearly as much as what you do next. I remember one night in West Virginia that nearly broke me. I'd parked at a little RV park tucked into the Appalachian foothills, surrounded by thick forests that seemed to breathe with every gust of wind. The place was nearly empty, just me, an older Airstream at the far end, and a young family in a travel trailer across the loop. At first, it felt peaceful, almost too quiet. But sometimes quiet has weight. It presses on you until you realize it isn't silence at all. It's waiting. Around midnight, I was jolted awake by a faint sound, like children laughing. My first thought was that the family's kids were up late, playing by the fire. But when I stepped outside, the fire pit was cold. Their trailer was dark. Still, the laughter came, faint and echoing through the trees, too far away to be them, too close to be safe. I froze on the gravel, the night air cold in my lungs. The sound shifted, laughter becoming whispers, whispers becoming something like chanting. The cadence rolled through the woods, rhythmic, deliberate. I couldn't make out words, but the pattern was unmistakable, call and response, a voice leading, another answering. I backed toward my RV, every nerve alight, when I noticed the Airstream at the far end. Its door was wide open, no lights inside, just black. And swaying gently from the awning was a lantern that hadn't been there earlier, its flame steady despite the restless wind. I didn't sleep after that. I sat behind the wheel, keys in hand, ready to leave. But some part of me couldn't start the engine. Maybe it was fear. Maybe it was the sense that if I drew attention to myself, whatever was out there would notice me for the first time. So I stayed frozen until dawn finally broke, painting the trees in pale gold. When the family emerged in the morning, I asked if they'd heard anything. They shook their heads, looked at me with polite confusion. When I turned back to point out the Airstream, the open door, the lantern, it was gone. Not just the lantern, the entire rig. Vanished, as if it had never been there at all. You learn to carry those nights in silence. Try explaining them to someone who's never lived on the road, and they'll call it stress, or fatigue, or paranoia. But those of us who keep rolling from one campground to the next, we recognize each other by the way our eyes linger on tree lines, by the hesitation before we open the door after midnight. We know. Sometimes, though, the fear isn't in the dark. It's in broad daylight, hiding in plain sight. A year later in New Mexico, I parked at a desert campground outside Santa Rosa. The ground was cracked and dry, the mesas glowing red under the sun. I set up camp and took a walk to stretch my legs. That's when I noticed the other rigs. They weren't old or abandoned. They looked staged. perfectly aligned, all their blinds drawn tight, all their steps pulled in, not a sound of life from any of them. I circled once, twice, expecting to hear a generator hum, smell cooking, catch a glimpse of someone through the glass. Nothing. The rigs just sat there, gleaming in the sun, like props on an empty stage. Back at my site, I felt eyes on me. No proof, no shadow moving, just the undeniable weight of being watched. And then, as I poured water into a pot, I heard it, the hiss of propane igniting. My stove. But I hadn't touched it. Flames rose from the burner, tall and blue. My hand trembled as I reached to shut it off. That night, I slept in the driver's seat, ready to go. Sometime around 3, the silence broke. I heard engines turning over, low rumbles from every direction. I sat rigid, staring through the windshield. One by one, the rig's headlights flicked on, bright, blinding in the desert dark, but none of them moved. They just sat there, engines idling, lights piercing the night. And then, just as suddenly, they shut off. Darkness returned, silence thickened. At dawn, the rigs were gone. The campground was empty. My site was the only one left, as if the desert had reset overnight. I drove away with my heart still pounding, and I didn't stop until I hit the Texas border. People often ask me, why don't you just quit? Why not go home, settle down, find safety in walls that don't move and doors that don't open to the wilderness? And maybe they're right. Maybe that would be the sane choice. But what they don't understand is that RV life isn't just about miles or scenery. It's about facing what the road gives you, even when it's ugly, even when it's terrifying. Every story you hear has roots somewhere. Some may be exaggerations. Some may be born of fatigue and fear. But others carry a truth that cuts deeper than any rational explanation. In Oregon, near Tillamook Forest, I once heard a woman describe waking to the sound of elk bugling outside her camper. It should have been ordinary. It was elk season, after all. But she said the sound didn't fade into the distance like a herd moving through. It circled her rig again and again until dawn. And when she stepped outside, she found no hoof prints, just a single set of human footprints, bare, leading into the mist. She never camped alone again. I've met men who swore they'd seen lights dancing above treetops, women who described shadows pacing around their rigs, families who abandoned campsites in the middle of the night without ever explaining why. Not all of these people can be making it up. Not all of them can be mistaken. And the deeper I travel, the more I realize the question isn't whether these dangerous RV stories are true. The question is how much truth you're willing to accept before it changes the way you live. Sometimes the truth is simple. Nature is vast. We are small. Isolation warps the mind. But other times the truth is stranger, that the land itself remembers, that it can play, can lure, can trap, that some roads don't want to be traveled, some sites don't want to be stayed in. And if you ignore that truth, if you laugh it off, you might be the next story someone else tells. The deeper you go into this life, the more you start asking yourself, am I drawn to the stories, or are the stories drawn to me? Because it isn't just the back roads and forgotten lots that feel heavy with them. It's the people too. Travelers carry pieces of fear the same way they carry maps, tucked away but always there when you need to unfold them. I remember pulling into a remote site in Idaho near the Salmon River. The evening was quiet, golden light spilling over the ridges, and I felt, for once, at ease. A couple in their 30s waved me over to share a drink. Their names were Callie and Brent, and they'd been full-timers for 2 years, chasing seasonal work and sunsets. At first, it was the usual small talk, where you've been, what you drive, what you've seen. But as night stretched thin, their smiles faltered. Callie leaned in, her voice barely louder than the crackle of the fire. "Have you ever heard footsteps on the roof?" I thought she was joking, but Brent's eyes told me otherwise. He nodded, slow. It happened twice, both times when we camped too close to rivers. They described waking in the dead of night to the creak of weight overhead, slow, measured steps pacing from one end of the rig to the other. Not raccoons, not branches falling, human steps. When Brent opened the door to check, nothing. No ladder, no tracks in the mud, just silence pressing down from every direction. It didn't stop until we moved, Callie whispered. Like, whatever it was wanted us to know it could find us anywhere, but not if we left. The fire popped, sending sparks into the dark, and none of us spoke for a long time. When I finally walked back to my rig, the roof above me felt thinner than paper. Every gust of wind sounded like something shifting its weight, deciding whether or not to step. It's that kind of detail, the way stories hook into your imagination, that makes you question reality. And once a seed like that is planted, you'll find yourself bracing for it. Lying awake, staring at the ceiling, waiting for the sound of steps that may never come. The farther west I traveled, the stranger the stories became. In Nevada's high desert, I met a retired ranger who told me about an RV park that had been abandoned overnight back in the 70s. Plates still on picnic tables, lawn chairs half folded, rigs left with doors ajar. No official explanation, just silence and dust swallowing the place whole. He swore the site was still there, though maps don't show it anymore. Said you can find it if you drive long enough without GPS, if you let the desert decide where you end up. When I asked him what would happen if you stayed there, his jaw clenched. You wouldn't leave, was all he said. That night, I dreamed of rows of empty rigs under a full moon, their windows glowing though no one was inside. I woke sweating, the desert air dry in my throat, and for a moment I couldn't shake the image. It wasn't the thought of ghosts that rattled me. It was the thought of absence, of places that erase you so completely the world forgets you were there at all. Maybe that's the heart of it. These stories don't just scare you. They remind you how thin the thread is that keeps us tethered to safety. One wrong turn, one bad decision, one night in the wrong place, and you could be the next question whispered around a fire. Did you hear what happened to them? I'll never forget Arizona. South of Flagstaff, in a stretch of ponderosa pines, I parked alone in a dispersed site. The evening was calm, shadows stretching long, the forest floor blanketed with needles. I cooked dinner, read a bit, settled in. Sometime after midnight, I woke to the sound of my fridge door opening. I froze, listening. The soft suction of the seal breaking, the faint clink of bottles shifting. I told myself it had to be the latch. Maybe I hadn't closed it tight, but then I heard it close. Deliberate, controlled. I sat in the dark, knife in hand, heart battering my ribs. No footsteps followed, no rustle, no sound at all. When dawn came, I checked every inch. Nothing disturbed, nothing missing. But the memory of that slow, intentional closing sound still haunts me, because if it wasn't the wind, if it wasn't a faulty latch, then someone or something was inside. That day, I learned a truth that every RVer eventually confronts. Sometimes your fear isn't what's outside the rig. Sometimes it's what makes its way in without your knowing. And still, I keep driving. Still, I keep listening. Because every story, whether true or half-true, holds a warning. They teach you to trust your instincts, to never dismiss unease as weakness. Unease is survival whispering in your ear. Once in Louisiana, I parked near a bayou. The water was black, still as glass, cypress knees jutting like bones. Locals warned me not to stay overnight, but I was stubborn. Around 2 a.m, I heard water lapping, steady ripples as though something massive circled just out of sight. Then came a knock. Gentle, 3 raps against the hull of my RV. I held my breath, another 3 raps, then silence. I couldn't bring myself to open the blinds, too afraid of what I'd see or wouldn't see on the other side. When morning broke, the soil around my tires was damp, soft, though no rain had fallen. And there, etched into the mud, were impressions too large for human feet, too wide for alligator tracks. I drove north that day, faster than I ever had before. So when people ask me, are these dangerous RV stories really true? I tell them this. Truth isn't always about proof. It's about experience. It's about what stays with you, what keeps you awake long after the fire burns low. The road is long and the stories are endless, but every one of them, in its own way, carries the same message. Respect the places you enter, because the land doesn't forget and sometimes it doesn't forgive. There's something about the Midwest that always fooled me into a false sense of safety. Open fields, gentle rolling hills, farmhouses with lights in their windows. It all looks so ordinary, so tame compared to the jagged mountains or the endless desert. But sometimes the ordinary hides the deepest strangeness. I was driving through southern Illinois, tired from hours behind the wheel when I pulled into a small family-run RV park just outside Shawnee National Forest. It was the kind of place where check-in was a handshake and a paper slip, where the gravel roads curved between maples heavy with summer leaves. Families sat out on lawn chairs, kids rode bikes in circles, and for a moment I thought, this is exactly what people dream of when they think RV life. Safe, comfortable, normal. But normal has cracks. Around 10 p.m., after the laughter of kids faded and the grills went cold, I stepped outside to stretch. The air was humid, the cicadas buzzing so loud it almost felt electric. That's when I noticed something off. Every other rig in the park, every single one, was dark. No porch lights, no TV glow, no murmurs of conversation, just black silhouettes against the trees. I stood there listening. The cicadas had stopped. My ears rang with the sudden absence. And then, faintly, I heard it. The scrape of metal. Slow. Dragging. It came from the far end of the park. I grabbed my flashlight, though every instinct told me not to. The beam cut across the gravel road, illuminating rows of silent RVs. Their windows reflected back at me like blind eyes. I followed the sound, heart hammering. When I rounded the last bend, my light landed on a sight that froze me in place. At the end of the loop stood an old Class C, rust eating through its seams. Its door was wide open, and inside, a chair scraped slowly across the floor. But there was no one in it, no one pushing it, just the sound of wood on linoleum dragging, stopping, dragging again. I killed the light and backed away. My throat was dry, every muscle tight, my body screaming at me to run, but knowing that running would make noise. I slipped back to my rig, locked every latch, and sat in the driver's seat until dawn. When the sun rose, the RV at the end was gone. Gravel smooth, no tire marks, as if it had never been there. That day, I learned that even in places wrapped in laughter and light, darkness waits. It waits until you're tired enough, alone enough to notice it. But the most unnerving story I've ever carried came from Oregon, told to me by a woman named Margaret. She was in her 60s, sharp-eyed, tough-skinned, the kind of traveler who'd seen storms rip awnings off rigs and watched engines die on mountain passes. Not someone easily rattled. We sat together at a communal fire pit, the forest pressing close around us. She leaned forward, her voice low, and said, "There's a trail out there that doesn't end. You walk it, and you'll circle back to your rig without turning once. People have gotten lost just a few steps from camp, and sometimes when they do make it back, they're not the same." I asked her what she meant. She stared at the flames. One man came back swearing he'd met himself. Same face, same clothes, standing in the trail, except the other version wouldn't speak, just stared until he couldn't take it anymore and ran. He left that night, never camped again. I laughed nervously, but Margaret didn't smile. She just said, "Some stories aren't meant to scare you. They're meant to warn you." That night, I dreamed of walking a trail that looped into itself, each step pulling me farther from who I was. And when I woke, I wasn't sure if I'd really slept at all. These are the kinds of tales that burrow deep. They don't let go easily. I think about Alaska often, even though I've only been once. Vast, unforgiving, beautiful. I camped near a gravel turnout along the Kenai Peninsula, the ocean crashing just beyond. At first it was perfect. Bald eagles overhead, the salt wind sharp in my lungs, but then the fog rolled in, thick and heavy, swallowing the horizon. I sat inside, sipping coffee, watching the mist curl against the glass. That's when I saw it. A figure, tall and lean, walking the edge of the water. At first I thought it was a fisherman. But the figure didn't cast a line, didn't bend, didn't move like a man. It just walked. And as it passed in front of the tide, it didn't blur or dim. The waves crashed through its legs, but it never broke stride. I blinked, rubbed my eyes, told myself it was the fog playing tricks, but then it stopped, turned its head, and though I couldn't see its face, I felt its gaze burn through me. The fog thickened. When it cleared, the shoreline was empty. I left the next morning, the ocean roaring behind me like a reminder. Some places are too vast for us, too old, too aware. So what do I make of all these experiences, these stories passed from one traveler to the next? I don't call them lies, but I don't call them truth either. They live in the space between. They exist in the rustle of trees, in the silent RV at the end of a loop, in the laughter carried by wind when no one's awake to make it. And maybe that's what makes them so powerful. Because whether they're real or not, they change you. They sharpen your instincts. They teach you to trust unease, to listen when the land speaks, to move when something tells you not to stay. I can't prove any of it, but I also can't shake the way my stomach drops when I hear tapping at night, or the way my breath slows when I see an empty sight that feels too empty. These stories shape the way I travel, the way I live. And if you're out there parked under a wide sky, fire low, listening for what might move in the dark, then maybe you already understand. Because the question isn't whether these dangerous RV stories are really true. The question is how close you're willing to get before you find out. Some stories, I think, are stitched into the roads themselves. You can feel them when your tires hum across certain stretches of asphalt, when the headlights cut through trees that lean too close, when the GPS drops signal as if even satellites won't watch. I've come to believe the danger isn't always in what you see. It's in what you can't shake after you've left. Take the night I drove through New Mexico, bound for a forgotten campground tucked near old mining roads. By day, the mesas stood tall, the sun painting everything red and gold. By night, the air cooled, shadows stretched, and I realized I hadn't seen another vehicle for hours. When I finally pulled into the campground, only one other rig sat there, a fifth wheel with curtains drawn. I parked, set up quick, and settled in. At midnight, I heard it, a low hum, mechanical, steady, not unlike a generator, but it wasn't coming from outside. It was in the walls, vibrating the frame, pulsing through my bones. I opened the door and the night was dead silent. No hum, no wind, just the pale glow of the fifth wheel across the lot. When I stepped back inside, the sound returned, louder, pressing. My hands shook as I unplugged everything, shut off the battery, checked every corner. The hum never stopped. And then, from the corner of my eye, I saw the curtain move. Not mine, theirs. A pale face pressed against the glass for only a second, too long and too still to be human curiosity. I drove out that night, leaving my leveling blocks behind, not caring what I lost. Sometimes survival means abandoning the small things. And that's the reality I wish more people understood. RV life isn't just sunsets and freedom. It's a test of instinct, a conversation with silence, a reminder that you're never truly in control. You hear stories of rigs vanishing, of travelers meeting themselves on looping trails, of voices calling from tree lines, and you might dismiss them until you live one, until you wake in the dead of night and realize you're no longer laughing at the stories. You're inside one. In Washington state, I parked along the edge of Olympic National Park, the rainforest dense and dripping around me. That night, the rain poured heavy, tapping the roof in uneven rhythms. I thought nothing of it until I realized the taps weren't random. They were repeating, a pattern. Too quick, one slow. Pause. Too quick, one slow. Again and again. My chest tightened. I knew then that sometimes the forest doesn't whisper. It knocks. And maybe that's why these stories endure. They're not just warnings, they're invitations. They pull us closer to the edge, make us confront how fragile we are. They remind us that no matter how modern our rigs, how bright our LED lights, how secure our locks, we are still guests in a land that doesn't owe us safety. So when people ask me with a smirk or with genuine fear, are these dangerous RV stories really true? I answer them with this. The road doesn't lie. The land doesn't lie. And neither do your instincts when your skin crawls, when your breath shortens, when the night presses too close. You don't need proof to respect fear. You don't need evidence to turn the key and drive away. The lesson isn't whether these stories are real. The lesson is knowing when to listen, when to move, when to trust the voice inside that whispers, "This place is not for you." I've come to think that maybe the truth lives in the middle, half in the ground beneath us, half in the mind we carry. But does it matter which half pulls you back from danger? Does it matter whether the footsteps on your roof belong to a person or a nightmare, as long as they make you leave before dawn? That's why I keep traveling. Not to prove the stories, not to disprove them, but to keep learning, to keep listening. Because the moment you stop listening, the moment you laugh off every whisper, every shadow, every knock, you risk becoming another silence that no one can explain. And maybe one night, your rig will sit empty at the end of a loop, door open, lantern glowing, your story folded into the countless others that ripple through campfires and desert winds. But until that night comes, I'll keep driving. I'll keep parking in forgotten places, keep watching the tree lines, keep feeling the weight of silence. Because out here, under the vast American sky, fear isn't an enemy. Fear is the compass that points you home. So I'll leave you with this. Next time you're camped beneath stars, flames low, and you hear a sound you can't explain, don't dismiss it. Don't rationalize it away. Let it teach you something. Let it remind you that you're alive, that you're paying attention, that you're still connected to a world that doesn't bend to your will. Because that's the answer to the question. Are these dangerous RV stories really true? Yes, in every way that matters. I never expected a simple detour off the highway to leave such a mark on me, to etch a fear so quietly deep that even now, weeks later, I can feel it in the hollow of my chest. I had been driving for hours through Idaho, the mountains rising like silent sentinels on either side, their slopes veined with streaks of late summer snow, pine forests thick and dark, the air thin and sharp. My RV, an old but reliable diesel model, rumbled steadily beneath me as I passed signs pointing to Shoshone Caverns. I hadn't planned to stop. I usually preferred open campgrounds, away from the narrow, winding roads tourists never seem to notice. But something about the faded wooden sign, hand-painted and swaying in the mountain wind, pulled me in. I could feel the pull, like an old memory brushing against the back of my mind, telling me I'd find something here, something I hadn't known I was looking for. The parking area was small, almost unkempt, a gravel lot bordered by high limestone walls that seemed to lean over themselves. I pulled the RV in between two other vehicles, both seemingly abandoned for hours, and shut off the engine. The silence hit first, pressing in, heavy and unnatural. Not the natural quiet of the mountains, where wind whispers through the trees and distant birds call to one another, but a kind of suspended quiet like the world had stopped breathing. I stepped out and felt the chill immediately, a cold creeping under the small of my back, through my shirt, into my bones, and I told myself it was just the shade of the cliffs, the late afternoon sun barely reaching the gravel. I set up camp in the usual way, leveling the jacks, connecting the electricity, checking the water, but even these mundane tasks felt off. The usual comfort I found in these small routines wasn't there. Instead, I kept catching glimpses of movement out of the corner of my eye. A flicker of shadow near the cliffs, the sound of something scuffing the gravel behind the RV. Every time I turned, nothing was there, just the wind in the scrub brush. I tried to laugh it off, telling myself I was tired, that my imagination had been sharpened too finely by all the horror stories I'd been listening to on the drive up. But even as I said it aloud, the sound of my own voice was oddly hollow, as though the canyon had swallowed it and returned only an echo I couldn't recognize. The entrance to the caverns was a low arch cut into the limestone, dark and damp-looking, a black mouth yawning against the cliffs. I grabbed my flashlight, my pack, and a small knife I carried for safety. Not that I'd ever really needed it before. The air inside was immediately colder, thick with the scent of wet stone and something I couldn't quite identify. There was a faint sweetness under the dampness, like overripe fruit gone bad, clinging to the walls and the floor. I stepped carefully, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the darkness, illuminating slick stone paths and narrow passages. My footsteps echoed, but there was another sound too, a scraping, faint but distinct, coming from deeper inside. I froze. I told myself it was probably just the shift of stone, the cave settling. But then it happened again, and this time I was sure I had heard a breath. Not mine, not any humans. Something was down there. I tried to calm myself, focusing on the beam of light, on the numbers in my GPS to measure the distance I'd walked, but the darkness had a way of folding in around me. Every corner I turned, every narrow hallway I passed seemed to stretch, elongate, making the cavern feel larger, more labyrinthine than it should have been. The scraping sound followed, always ahead of me, just beyond the edge of my vision. I paused at one particularly narrow passage where the walls nearly touched my shoulders, leaning in as if to listen. That's when I noticed the scratches on the stone. Not the natural striations of limestone, but deliberate gouges, irregular, deep, claw-like. They ran from floor to ceiling in a diagonal pattern, as though something or someone had tried to climb the walls in a frenzy. My stomach turned. The logical part of me knew it could be wildlife, bears perhaps, but bears didn't leave trails like that in a place like this. Bears didn't follow you, quietly, deliberately, as if testing you. I stepped back, breathing shallowly, and turned to leave. But the passage I had entered didn't look the same. The walls had shifted, or maybe the memory of them had shifted in my mind. But the exit I'd come through seemed farther away, obscured by jagged rock. Panic started to bloom like a slow poison. I called out, "Hello?" My voice sounded small, weak, swallowed by the cavern. The scraping stopped. Absolute silence returned, more suffocating than the first. I told myself to stay calm, to retrace my steps, but every turn seemed wrong. The cavern had become a trap, a space that shouldn't exist in the dimensions I knew outside, and yet there it was, stretching on. That night, back in the RV, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every time I stepped outside, I imagined shadows slipping along the cliff edges, figures crouched low, or maybe pressed against the rock like insects hiding from the sun. The wind whispered through the pines, but now it carried a subtle undertone, a low keening, almost like a chant. I told myself it was the wind passing through the cavern mouths. That sound engineers call it a natural resonance. But it wasn't just sound, it was a presence, faint, almost imperceptible, shifting the air near my ears. I barely slept, waking at every imagined noise, flashlight in hand, scanning the darkness outside. Morning didn't bring relief. The other vehicles in the lot had vanished overnight, and the gravel was undisturbed except for my own tire marks. There was no one else. No human footprint, no trash, no signs of anyone living or traveling nearby. The landscape seemed rearranged. The cliffs appeared taller, the shadows sharper. I started the RV and drove cautiously, keeping the cavern entrance in view through the rearview mirror. And that's when I saw it. A figure, just beyond the tree line, standing perfectly still. Not moving. Not breathing, it seemed. I squinted, thinking it must be a local, some hiker or spelunker who had arrived early. But the proportions were wrong. The figure's limbs were too long, its posture too stiff, its face obscured by a shadow I couldn't penetrate. I told myself to keep moving, that once I got back on the highway, the figure would vanish. But as I turned the wheel, I realized I couldn't remember the road I had driven in on. The curves, the bends, the landmarks. They had shifted. Panic rose sharply, a tightening in my chest that made it hard to breathe. I wanted to call for help, to dial 911, but the phone had no signal. The mountains weren't just surrounding me, they were watching, rearranging themselves, guiding me into corridors of stone I didn't recognize. I pressed harder on the accelerator, the RV groaning, tires scraping against gravel and jagged rock, and the figure followed, silent, patient, a dark outline in my mirrors. I didn't stop until the asphalt of a main highway finally met the tires of my RV. I didn't look back. Even now, when I tell this story, I can feel the uneven weight of those cliffs pressing against my spine, the sensation of unseen eyes tracing me as I moved. I've been back to Shoshone Caverns since, in the daylight, with company, cameras, friends, and the paths all seem normal, harmless. The caves are well marked, the guides polite. But I know what I felt in those shadows. I know what was waiting just beyond the edge of my vision. And more importantly, I know that sometimes in the quiet moments when the wind passes through stone, it whispers for you to remember, to never forget that fear can be patient and it doesn't always need to move to terrify you. Even after I had left the caverns behind, the memory of that first night clung to me like the frost that sometimes creeps into the corners of your RV windows in the mountains. I tried to convince myself it was just fatigue, a mind stretched too thin by long hours of driving and isolation. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. There was something in the stone itself, something patient, waiting. And so, despite my attempts at normalcy, I felt compelled to return. Not for curiosity, not for thrill, but because my instincts whispered that I had left something unresolved, something unfinished. A week later, I found myself retracing the same route, this time not alone. I had convinced my friend, Claire, to join me. Claire had grown up exploring Idaho's forests and had a way of reading the land like a book, understanding its moods, its subtle warnings. I trusted her judgment, and if anything could temper my own unease, it was her calm, analytical presence. We pulled into the same gravel lot, and at first glance, it appeared ordinary. Sunlight spilling across the limestone cliffs, the wind rustling the pine needles in a familiar, almost comforting rhythm. But as soon as we stepped out of the RV, a different tension gripped me. The air smelled heavier, the stone colder, sharper, as though it had absorbed some unseen presence during the week I had been gone. Claire noticed it too. "It's different," she murmured, running her hand along the limestone wall, her fingers tracing the grooves and cracks. "Like it's breathing." I tried to shrug it off, laughed lightly, but my voice sounded small, swallowed by the cliffs, and I could see the hesitation in her eyes. We decided to explore the caves together, slowly this time, deliberately marking our path. The narrow passageways seemed more aggressive than I remembered, angles sharper, ceilings lower, shadows deeper. As we moved further in, the sound of dripping water echoed through the caverns, a rhythm that felt almost like a heartbeat. It wasn't our heartbeat, it was something else. Steady, patient, waiting. I kept imagining the figure I had seen from the RV, its elongated form, its unnatural stillness, and with every step the scraping noises returned, faint, deliberate, always just ahead of our flashlights. At one point, we reached a chamber so wide it seemed to swallow the beams of our flashlights. The walls were etched with markings, ancient, irregular, chaotic. I felt the hairs on my arms rise. "These aren't natural," I whispered. Claire nodded, her face pale in the flashlight glow. "Someone or something made these," she said. "And I don't think they did it recently. But there's a pattern. Look." She pointed to a series of scratches that spiraled toward the center of the chamber, almost like a ritual, almost like a warning. I felt a chill creep through me. I wanted to rationalize, to say it was centuries-old spelunker marks or natural erosion that fooled the eye, but my body refused the lie. Every instinct screamed that this was a message, etched into stone for reasons we weren't meant to understand. We paused, listening. For a long moment, only our breathing and the distant dripping of water filled the space. And then faintly a sound that made my stomach twist, a low, rasping exhale, like breath against stone. I froze, Claire froze, our eyes meeting in silent acknowledgement. Whoever or whatever was here. It wasn't just waiting, it was aware. We decided to retreat, marking our route meticulously, retracing our steps. But the cave had changed again. Passages we had taken earlier seemed subtly different, narrower in some places, wider in others. Shadows shifted in ways that made the walls appear to move. I could feel my pulse hammering in my ears, my hands trembling despite my efforts to stay composed. Claire, usually so grounded, was tense, her flashlight shaking slightly. I realized then that this fear wasn't just in my mind. It had bled into hers, infecting the space between us with a quiet, insistent dread. Then, without warning, we heard it clearly. The scraping sound again, closer this time, followed by a soft thud, like stone being tapped from the inside. My legs wanted to run, but my mind argued with itself, trying to measure the distance, the possibilities. I shone my flashlight toward the sound and saw movement, a flicker at the edge of vision. Something small? Something large? I couldn't tell. But whatever it was deliberate. It was watching us. We picked up the pace, our footsteps echoing like gunshots through the cavern. I felt my chest tighten, the sense of claustrophobia growing unbearable. Every turn we took seemed wrong, the passages rearranging themselves subtly, deliberately, twisting into paths we hadn't taken. I called Claire's name, voice breaking slightly, and she answered, but her voice sounded distant, distorted by the stone. I realized then that the cavern didn't just shift in space, it shifted perception, bending reality in subtle, terrifying ways. Finally, we emerged into a smaller chamber, one I didn't recognize from my previous visit. The air here was thick, almost viscous, and a low moan seemed to vibrate through the walls. I stumbled, gripping the stone for support, and that's when I saw them. Faint, shadowed figures pressed against the walls, impossibly thin, unmoving, watching. Not human, not animal. Something my throat went dry. Claire gasped behind me. I wanted to tell myself it was my mind, that the cave was playing tricks, but the instinctual fear in my gut was undeniable. We didn't wait to rationalize. I grabbed Claire's arm, and we ran. The passages twisted, narrowed, elongated, each step a struggle against the very stone itself. The scraping followed, now louder, accompanied by a wet, dragging sound that made my stomach lurch. I had to force myself to breathe, to keep moving, to keep my mind from snapping under the weight of primal terror. And then, finally, a faint glimmer of daylight, the exit. I burst out of the cavern into the sunlight, lungs burning, heart hammering, and for a brief moment I felt relief. But the relief was short-lived. The parking lot was empty again. The vehicles, the people, everything we had seen on our approach were gone. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Claire and I looked at each other, and in that silent acknowledgement we understood. The caverns hadn't released us. They had allowed us a reprieve, a narrow passage back to the ordinary world, but they remembered us. They were patient, enduring. And as we drove away, my eyes kept returning to the cliffs, to the shadowed mouths of the caves, and I knew, with a certainty that gnawed at the edges of my rational mind, that the caverns of Shoshone weren't just stone and darkness. They were sentient, ancient, and vigilant, waiting for the next curious traveler who thought they could walk unobserved. The next days passed in a haze, though outwardly I tried to maintain the semblance of normalcy. I returned to the routines I relied on, checking the RV, driving cautiously along familiar highways, making lists of supplies and repairs. But beneath the surface, I was restless. Every shadow seemed too deep, every rustle in the pine too deliberate. At night, I dreamt of the cavern walls closing in on me, of elongated figures pressing against stone, whispering in tones I couldn't quite hear but somehow understood. Claire avoided discussing it, perhaps wisely. Silence became our unspoken agreement, a shield against the creeping dread that threatened to consume our waking hours. But the pull of the caverns didn't relent. On the fourth night after our second visit, I found myself driving back alone, drawn by a mixture of stubborn curiosity and something darker, an unnameable compulsion. The highway twisted through the mountains, the diesel engine of my RV humming under my hands like a heartbeat I could barely control. I told myself it was reckless, foolish even, but every mile closer felt like a step toward clarity, toward understanding what had watched me from the shadows. When I reached the gravel lot, the sun was just beginning to dip behind the limestone cliffs, casting long, distorted shadows. The air was colder than I remembered, sharp with a scent that was simultaneously sweet and decayed. My skin prickled under the tension. I didn't unpack. I didn't linger. I grabbed my flashlight, a small pack of essentials, and stepped toward the cavern entrance, each footfall on the gravel sounding too loud, too final. Inside, the cave was alive. Not with wind or water, but with sound that didn't belong to the natural world. The scraping returned almost immediately, faint but deliberate, echoing in rhythm with the faint pulse I felt in the walls. I stepped carefully, trying to mark my path, but the passages warped as I moved. Walls that had been flat now bulged slightly, ceilings that had seemed low now arched higher. I realized in a cold clarity that the caverns didn't merely trap the body, they manipulated perception, bending reality in subtle, insidious ways that broke the mind slowly. Hours, or perhaps minutes, it was impossible to tell, passed as I navigated the labyrinth. The sound grew louder, closer, accompanied now by something else, a low, guttural hum, resonant, vibrating through my chest. My flashlight caught movement at the periphery, fleeting shadows that seemed almost human, yet impossibly thin, impossibly elongated. They pressed against walls, ceiling, floor, their forms melding with the stone, as though the cavern itself had grown them. Panic clawed at me, but I forced my breathing into rhythm, remembering Claire's calm presence from before, trying to emulate it, to anchor myself in reason. Then I reached a chamber unlike any I had seen. The walls were carved in chaotic spirals, spiraling into a central pit that seemed to descend into absolute darkness. I felt my stomach turn, a physical nausea that came from the knowledge that whatever had created these markings was intelligent, deliberate, and patient. And then I saw it, a figure far larger than any human pressed against the stone opposite the pit. Its head turned slowly toward me, elongated limbs folding and stretching in ways my mind refused to fully register. Its eyes, or the closest approximation, gleamed faintly, reflecting my flashlight like shards of broken glass. I froze. Every instinct screamed to run, but my legs refused to move. And yet, despite its grotesque form, I felt a connection, an awareness that it knew me, that it had been following, studying, waiting. The scraping and hum ceased, replaced by a suffocating silence. I could feel its gaze, a presence so dense it pressed against my chest, making each breath a labor. I whispered, almost involuntarily, "Why are you here?" There was no answer, only a shift in the stone around it, a subtle rearrangement that suggested movement without sound. The pit before me seemed to deepen, stretching into an abyss I couldn't comprehend. And in that instant, I understood the caverns were alive, not in the sense of creatures dwelling within, but in the sense of consciousness, an ancient sentience that regarded all intruders as part of its experiment, its memory, its endless watch. Fear propelled me at last. I backed away, careful not to make sudden movements that might provoke it. Every step felt measured, each turn of the flashlight deliberate. The passages twisted in ways I couldn't anticipate, yet somehow instinct guided me. A subconscious mapping of the labyrinth that kept me just ahead of its patient observation. My hands were slick with sweat, my breaths shallow, every nerve alight with tension. And then I saw a narrow crevice leading upward, faint daylight spilling in. I didn't hesitate. I squeezed through, scraping my shoulders and arms on rough stone, ignoring the pain, driven purely by the desire to escape. The exit was almost mockingly narrow, forcing my body to contort. I emerged into the fading sunlight, the cool air biting my face, and I stumbled across the gravel lot. My RV was there, exactly where I had left it, yet the cliffs around it seemed different. The shadows were deeper, more deliberate, stretching toward me as though trying to warn me to leave. I climbed inside, locked the doors, and started the engine. As I drove away, the sensation never fully lifted. I kept glancing at the cliffs, at the cavern mouths, and I could feel, even from the highway, the weight of ancient eyes tracking my movement. It wasn't merely fear I carried. It was awareness, a subtle reminder that some places in this world remember you long after you've left, long after you think you've escaped. Weeks later, I returned to the mountains again, but not to the caves. I stayed at an RV campground further down the valley, surrounded by other travelers, families, and laughter. I kept to myself, kept my distance from the woods. And yet every time the wind shifted, every time a shadow fell across my campsite, I felt it, the pull, the quiet insistence of stone, patient and eternal, reminding me that the caverns of Shoshone are not merely a destination for the curious. They are a mirror, reflecting fear back at anyone who enters, testing patience, resolve, and the fragile boundaries of human perception. I learned that fear, the kind that roots itself in your bones and refuses to release you, is not always the result of something external. Sometimes it comes from a place deeper, an awareness that there are things in this world that do not obey logic, that watch, that wait. And in those moments, when the wind whispers through stone and shadows stretch impossibly long, it becomes clear. The lesson of the caverns is not to conquer fear, but to recognize it, respect it, and survive it. To move carefully, to observe, to remember, and never ever believe that any place of quiet darkness is truly empty. Even now, as I park my RV under the open sky, far from Shoshone, the memory lingers. The scratches in the stone, the scraping in the darkness, the elongated figure watching from the shadows, they remain with me. Not as nightmares, but as a living lesson. That the earth itself has consciousness, patience, and boundaries we are not meant to cross lightly. And in honoring that, in respecting the quiet and the stone, I carry a kind of survival, a deep understanding that some encounters are meant not to thrill or terrify for sport, but to awaken something primal within, a recognition that fear can teach if only we listen. The days after that last visit passed slowly, the kind of slow that feels like it is stretching time itself, every moment tinged with an awareness I couldn't shake. I camped in other places, far from the mountains, far from Shoshone, but nothing looked the same anymore. Even the ordinary forests, the rivers, the sunlit meadows, all seemed to carry an echo of the caverns. Shadows lingered longer than they should. The wind carried whispers I could not place. It was as though the caverns had imprinted on my perception, teaching me that the world was far more patient, far more observant than I had ever understood. I tried to tell people about it in passing, over campfires or quiet conversations with fellow RV travelers, but it was always the same. Polite nods, half smiles, dismissive glances. It's just caves, they said. You're letting your imagination run wild. I wanted to argue, to explain the shape-shifting passages, the clawed walls, the figures pressed against the stone, but I knew that no one could understand, not fully, not unless they had felt the stone itself, had walked its corridors, had realized how it can watch without moving, wait without leaving traces. I learned that fear, in its purest form, is private, and some lessons are meant to remain unspoken, carried quietly in the chest where they can't be dismissed. I returned to Shoshone one final time, but not to enter. I parked the RV at the edge of the valley and watched the cliffs from a distance. The late afternoon sun slanted across the limestone, shadows pooling in the cavern mouths. I could see the openings, dark and still, and I imagined the figures inside, patient as ever, waiting for the next traveler who might cross the threshold unprepared. I realized then that the caverns were not simply a place, they were a guardian, a teacher, a mirror. They reflected fear, yes, but also awareness, humility, and respect. To walk away was not cowardice, it was understanding. To survive was not just physical, it was emotional, spiritual, a recognition that some boundaries in the natural world are sacred, deliberate, enduring. That evening, I set up my RV under a wide canopy of pines at a small campground near a river, miles from the caverns. I made a fire, simple and controlled, and watched the flames flicker and dance. The wind rustled the needles above, carrying with it the faint scent of stone and cold air, and I felt the memory of the caverns settle within me, not as terror, but as a presence, a quiet teacher. Claire and I spoke over the fire, sharing glances that carried the weight of our shared understanding. There was no need for words, the lessons were clear. Some places demand reverence, some fears must be honored, and sometimes the bravest act is to recognize the limits of your knowledge and respect the ancient patience that surrounds you. Night came fully, and I lay in my RV listening to the river's steady rush and the distant calls of nocturnal creatures. The memory of Shoshone caverns whispered to me in the rhythm of the wind through the trees, in the subtle shift of shadows, in the way the air pressed against the RV as though reminding me of the stone's patient vigilance. I did not feel panic. I did not feel hunted. I felt connected, aware, and awake in a way that only those who have confronted the quiet, enduring watch of something older than themselves can understand. Fear had been a guide, a teacher, and I had listened. In the days that followed, I traveled further, exploring new campgrounds, rivers, and forests, but the lessons of Shoshone never left me. I approached each site with a heightened awareness, noticing subtle changes in the environment, listening for the faintest sounds, and trusting instincts that had once been easy to dismiss. I spoke to no one about what I had truly seen, understanding that some experiences are meant to shape you quietly, privately, and permanently. Every twist of road, every shadow under the trees reminded me that life is fragile, perception is delicate, and respect for the unseen is not fear. It is wisdom. Even now, years later, whenever I park my RV at the edge of a forest or near a quiet mountain stream, I feel the weight of those caves, a subtle pull in the air, a whisper of patience that reminds me the world has boundaries, the stones remember, the shadows wait. And if you enter with arrogance or carelessness, the consequences are not always immediate, but they are enduring. I carry the lessons with me in every journey, in every breath, in every quiet moment when the wind passes through the trees. I learned that fear is not a weakness. It is a compass. It is a signal, quiet but insistent, that directs you towards safety, respect, and awareness. And the caverns of Shoshone, those patient, ancient guardians, taught me that the line between terror and understanding is thin, delicate, and sacred. To walk away is not failure. To survive is not luck. It is listening, observing, and honoring the silent, enduring wisdom that surrounds us, often in places we least expect. As I start the engine of my RV and drive away under the wide Idaho sky, I glance one last time at the cliffs. The shadows pool in the cavern mouths, waiting, patient, eternal. And I know that I carry with me a knowledge few will ever understand, a fear that is also a guide, and a story that is not mine to embellish, only to remember. Because some encounters, some lessons, cannot be shared without losing their essence. They exist to shape you quietly, imperceptibly, until you move through the world with eyes that see more than light, with instincts sharpened by the patient watch of something far older than yourself. And so I drive on, not unafraid but awakened, carrying the weight and the gift of the caverns. Every mile, every turn, a reminder that the world is far larger, far stranger, and far more patient than we can ever truly grasp. And in that knowledge, in that careful, attentive awareness, there is not only survival, but a profound, unshakable sense of connection to the earth, its shadows, and its quiet, enduring watch. I've learned something about the woods that most people don't want to admit. They look like safety from the highway, like a green wall that promises quiet, solitude, and a kind of return to something simpler. But step inside, camp under those trees long enough, and they stop being background. They start breathing with you, pressing against your thoughts, shaping the way you hear yourself. I used to tell myself that was just the stillness. I don't think that anymore. I was 37 the year it happened, a decade into running my old Volkswagen camper across the western parks, filming short videos about quiet trails, forgotten campsites, the kind of places where you could park for a week and never see another person. I wasn't trying to chase danger. I wasn't looking for folklore. I just wanted that silence to record, something I could share with people who were stuck in apartments or gray office cubicles, dreaming of a campfire. I thought the quiet was a gift. Olympic National Park was my destination that spring. I'd been there before, but always on the edges, by the beaches, near the public campgrounds. This time I drove deeper. A ranger I'd met years ago, a man named Harris, had told me once that the interior forests were different. He didn't mean bigger trees or wetter moss. He meant there was a shift in how you felt after a few nights out there. He'd smiled when he said it, the kind of smile that tells you the sentence isn't finished. Stay long enough, he'd added, and you'll see what I mean. It had stuck with me. That year, I wanted to test it. I set up camp off a service road that looked like it hadn't seen traffic in months. The potholes were filled with still rainwater, black as mirrors, and the underbrush pressed right to the edge of the gravel. I backed my Volkswagen into a small pull-off, close enough to the tree line that I could step out and touch damp bark without walking 5 paces. There was no sound of highway, no chatter of other campers, just dripping branches and the faint hiss of the river somewhere below. That first night, I slept well. The kind of sleep that comes from driving too many miles, eating too little, and staring too long at endless green. But in the middle of the night, I woke to the sound of footsteps. At least, that's what I thought at first. They were slow, dragging, like someone testing the ground with their heel. I told myself it was an elk, or maybe a black bear circling the van. My instinct said human, though. It was the rhythm that did it. Even half asleep, you know the difference between animal movement and the cadence of someone walking. I held my breath. The steps circled once around the van. Then, silence. No brush of leaves, no crack of twigs, just nothing. I must have stayed awake for an hour listening before I finally drifted off again. By morning, I almost convinced myself it was a dream. Almost. When I stepped out into the pale gray daylight, the ground was wet with dew, soft enough that tracks should have shown. But there weren't any around the van. Not from animals. Not from boots. The soil was untouched except where my own shoes had sunk the day before. I told myself maybe the noise had carried from far away. Sound plays tricks in forests like this. But I checked twice before boiling coffee. I circled the van, stared into the dripping underbrush, and waited for the unease to fade. It didn't. I packed lightly for a day hike, thinking that if I kept moving, the woods would feel less like they were closing in. I followed the faint service trail deeper, letting the smell of wet cedar and soil mix with the faint metallic tang of the river. My camera bumped against my chest, recording small snippets of trail, just filler footage. I wasn't expecting to capture anything unusual. But a mile in, I found something. At first, it looked like a fallen tree, moss thick on the trunk, but as I stepped closer, I realized it wasn't wood. It was a ranger's hat, half buried, covered in moss so dense it looked like the forest had tried to reclaim it. I knelt, brushing aside the growth, and my stomach went cold. The hat still held its shape. Inside, there was a name stitched in faded black thread. Harris. I froze. The man who'd told me about this place, about what time does to you here. I hadn't seen him in years. I lifted the hat, shaking off wet clumps of moss. The ground beneath it was strange, sunken softer than the soil around it. When I pressed my boot down, water seeped up. For a moment it felt like the forest was breathing under me, exhaling through the ground. I didn't dig. I couldn't. Something in me screamed not to. I just set the hat on a rock and backed away, my skin prickling as though the trees themselves were aware of me standing there. That night, I left the hat on the dash of the Volkswagen. I told myself it was proof, maybe a story I could tell later, but I didn't film it. I couldn't. Every time I lifted the camera, my chest tightened, like recording it would make something notice me. Sleep didn't come easy. Around midnight, the sound returned. Footsteps, this time closer, slower, not circling the van, approaching. I sat up in the darkness, holding my breath again, listening. The steps stopped just outside the door. I reached for the hat on the dash, and as my fingers touched the damp fabric, something tapped 3 times against the metal side of the van. Not a branch, not an animal. Knuckles. The knock was soft but deliberate. That rhythm, the pause between each strike, spoke more than the sound itself. It wasn't random. It wasn't the scuffle of a raccoon or the scrape of wind. It was someone out there, standing just beyond the thin sheet of metal that separated me from the dripping dark. My chest went rigid. My hands stayed locked on the ranger's hat. I didn't move for what felt like minutes, listening. The forest didn't answer. No more steps, no more knocks, just the heavy quiet of branches sagging under rain. When I finally exhaled, it came out shaky, too loud in the silence. I thought about opening the curtain by the driver's seat just to see. But the other half of me, the half that had grown up hearing stories about campers disappearing, about people walking into the trees and never walking back, begged me to stay put. I waited. At some point, exhaustion must have pulled me under. I woke in the gray before dawn, stiff in the driver's seat, hat still in my grip. The van's windows were streaked with condensation, the kind that blurs the outside world into shapes that almost look like faces if you stare long enough. I wiped the glass with my sleeve. My breath caught. On the driver's side door, smeared into the dew, were handprints. Not full, clear palms, just the faint impression of fingers dragged downward, 5 long streaks beginning at the top edge of the window, ending where the door met the frame. I told myself to get out, to drive away right then, before curiosity rooted me further. But something about leaving felt just as dangerous, like whatever had touched the van would follow, waiting until I was deeper in, more alone. I brewed coffee instead, pretending normalcy could shield me. The steam curled upward, filling the van with a bitter warmth. That's when I noticed it. The hat, the name Harris, was darker than the night before. The thread looked damp, swollen, like it had absorbed water. But when I touched it, my fingers came away dry. I shoved it into the storage compartment under the passenger seat, out of sight, out of reach. I set out for another hike, this time staying closer to the van. I told myself it was research, that I was chasing footage for my channel, but I was really chasing answers. The forest wasn't the same. Every bird call made me flinch. Every snap of a branch felt aimed at me. The further I walked, the more I noticed it, the absence of anything human. No old fire rings, no boot prints, not even litter. It was like no one had stepped into this part of the forest for years. Yet halfway down a ridge, I found something that didn't fit. A ranger's jacket. It was draped over a branch, sleeves hanging like arms. Moss had grown across the fabric, but the color still bled through, muted green with a patch on the shoulder. I touched it, half expecting it to fall apart. But it held, damp and heavy. In the pocket was a folded piece of paper, sealed in a thin plastic sleeve, yellowed with age. I peeled it open with numb fingers. The handwriting was sharp, pressed deep into the page. If you hear it, don't answer. If it calls your name, don't look. Harris. My throat closed. I shoved the paper back into the sleeve, into my pack, and practically ran back to the van. That night, I didn't cook. I didn't build a fire. I locked the doors, curled into the back, and listened to the rain pound against the roof. Hours passed. No footsteps, no knocks, just the endless hiss of water. Then, through the static of rain, I heard it. A voice. Faint at first, almost hidden in the weather. It was calling my name. Not a shout, just a low, deliberate whisper stretched across the dark. Daniel. I froze. The whisper came again, closer, more urgent. Daniel. I pressed my palms against my ears, shaking my head. My heart slammed against my ribs, trying to punch its way out. The note, the warning. If it calls your name, don't look. I didn't. I stayed curled in the back, eyes shut so tight I saw sparks. The voice circled the van, slow, patient. Every time it passed the windows, it spoke. My name, sliding like wet cloth across my mind. By the third lap, it didn't sound like me anymore. It was my mother's voice, then an old friend's, then Harris's. Each time I clenched tighter, knuckles white, nails biting into my palms. Then it stopped. Silence so thick it felt like weight. I waited. Minutes stretched into hours. My body shook with exhaustion, but I didn't let myself move until the pale gray of dawn bled through the curtains. When I finally opened the door, the world smelled wrong. The forest air, usually clean and sharp with pine, was sour, like rotting leaves stirred with something metallic, something almost like blood. I stepped out, and that's when I saw them. Boot prints, not one set, dozens. All around the van, pressed into the wet soil. They circled, overlapped, wove between trees, too many to count, but none of them led away. They all stopped just at the tree line, as though whoever left them had melted into the woods. My skin crawled. I knew I couldn't stay. I needed to leave, needed to get the van back on asphalt, away from this place. But when I opened the driver's door, the hat was back on the dash. Dry, clean, perfect. And the name stitched inside, it no longer said Harris, it said Daniel. The letters stitched into the hat seemed to pulse when I stared at them. My name, threaded in neat black script, looked as though it had been there all along, not replaced, not altered, just waiting. I slammed the glove box shut, trapping it inside, and shoved my hands against the steering wheel. My first thought was to start the engine, peel down the service road, and never look back. But the road was narrow, full of washouts, and the river ran too close to the embankment. Driving blind in panic could have meant dropping the van into a gorge before I made it out. So I sat there, breath fogging the windshield, arguing with myself. One side whispered logic. Leave, forget the trip, post nothing. The other side pushed a quieter, darker idea. Stay, just long enough to understand what Harris had meant. I hated that part of me, the part that leaned toward answers even when the questions smelled like rot. By afternoon, I told myself I'd compromise, move camp at least. Somewhere closer to the main road, somewhere the air didn't taste sour. I drove out, tires spitting mud, eyes flicking to every shadow along the way. But the forest doesn't give up that easily. A mile down the service road, I came across another pull-off. This one had the husk of a fire ring, collapsed into ash and rusted tin. I parked, convinced myself the distance mattered, that this was a clean slate. I cooked over the camp stove that night, beans hissing, the ordinary smell masking some of the unease. For a few hours, I almost believed I'd outpaced whatever had found me, until the wind shifted. The air carried smoke, not from my stove. It was thicker, older, the sharp sting of wood smoldering. But when I stepped outside, the world was still. My little blue flame burned alone. Then I saw it, up the ridge, through a lattice of cedar trunks, a faint orange glow. Cabin lights. At least that's what it looked like. 2 windows, square and steady against the dark. I stood frozen with my fork still in my hand, staring. No cabins showed on my map. No signs marked any trail toward a ranger station. But the light was undeniable. Curiosity, or stupidity, dragged me up the slope with a flashlight. The closer I got, the more the glow seemed to retreat. Not fade, not dim, just pull further back between the trees. Each step forward stretched the distance until I realized I'd been climbing for nearly half an hour, and the glow was no closer than when I began. I stopped, bent double with breathless legs, and shut off my flashlight. Darkness. Only the sound of water dripping from branches. And yet, when my eyes adjusted, the glow was still there, hovering. I stumbled back down, and branches lashing my arms convinced the forest was baiting me. When I reached the van again, sweat clinging to my skin despite the cold, I nearly collapsed against the door. My little camp stove had gone out, beans congealed in the pot. But that wasn't what froze me. On the ground beside the stove was a pile of stones, small, round river rocks stacked into a careful tower as tall as my knee. I hadn't built it. I crushed the pile with my boot, scattering the stones into the mud. The sound of them tumbling was louder than it should have been, like breaking something sacred. I kicked them again, harder, until the tower was gone. That night, the whisper came back. It didn't start with my name this time. It started with Harris's. Over and over, dragged through the dark like a thread pulled too tight. Harris, Harris, Harris. I curled inside the van, knees to my chest, fighting the urge to peel back the curtains. But then, like water spilling into cracks, the voice changed. Daniel. My blood turned to ice. The whisper slithered beneath the doorframe, into my head, into my ribs. It sounded closer than it had before, not outside, but inside the van itself. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying not to breathe. Then came the second sound. Faint at first, then undeniable. Rocks clicking together. 2 stones knocking rhythmically, just beneath the floor of the van. Click, click, click. I shoved my hands against my ears, but the sound drilled through bone, through thought, until I nearly screamed. And then silence. When morning bled gray through the trees, I stumbled outside, half expecting to see another tower waiting for me. The ground was bare, no rocks, no footprints, nothing. But when I opened the glove box to check the hat, my stomach hollowed. It was gone. In its place was something else. A ranger's badge, dulled with scratches. Across the face of it, etched into the metal with something sharp, was a single word: listen. I staggered back, nearly falling into the mud. Every instinct screamed to drive, to tear down that road until I reached asphalt, gas stations, and noise. But the badge anchored me. Harris hadn't just disappeared out here. He'd left a trail. Notes, warnings, artifacts, half swallowed by the forest. And now, somehow, he'd left this. I told myself one more day. Just one. I'd follow the ridge again, but smarter. Compass in hand, leaving markers as I went. If there was a cabin, if there was something to find, I'd see it. Then I'd leave, answers in my pocket, van pointed east. The forest didn't argue. It just stood there, silent, green, endless. By noon, I was halfway up the slope again. This time the light wasn't there. No glow between the trees. Just shadows and dripping branches. But something else was. Half buried in a patch of moss lay a notebook, its cover swollen with moisture. I peeled it open, pages stuck together, ink running into black veins. Most of it was unreadable, but one page near the middle was still clear. It was Harris's handwriting. Don't follow the voices. They don't end. They only change faces. If you hear rocks, it's already too late. My chest tightened. I tucked the notebook under my arm, stumbling back toward the van with shaking legs. Every shadow seemed to lean closer. Every branch scratched too much like whispers. By the time I reached camp, I was sprinting. The van looked different. The stones were back. Not a tower this time rose, dozens of them, perfectly lined, leading from the fire ring straight to the van door. And every single one was wet, shining as though they'd just been pulled from a riverbed. The stones gleamed in the gray light, slick and glistening as though they'd just been lifted from underwater. They made a path, deliberate, unbroken, right up to my van's door. I couldn't move. My boots rooted into the mud, lungs refusing to pull in air. Someone or something had been here while I was gone. Not just circling, not just knocking, but arranging, marking. The thought of opening the door made bile rise in my throat. My keys trembled in my hand as I forced myself forward. Each step over the stones felt like stepping into a trap. The van was supposed to be safe, a metal shell separating me from the endless forest. But when I slid the key into the lock, a cold certainty washed over me. I wasn't locking the world out anymore. I was locking something in. Inside, the air was heavy, damp, metallic. It smelled wrong, like iron and mold mixed together. I gagged, pulling my shirt over my face. The bed was damp to the touch, as though someone had lain there dripping wet. My camera, which I'd left charging, was on the floor. The lens cap was off. My hands shook as I picked it up. The battery light blinked green. Against every instinct, I pressed playback. The screen lit, grainy footage filling the display. It showed the van's interior, my bed, my stove, empty. Then the camera shifted, panning slowly toward the back door. But I hadn't filmed it. The frame held still for a moment, and then faintly the sound came through. Stones clicking together. Click, click, click. The screen went black. I dropped the camera like it had burned me. That night I didn't sleep. I sat behind the wheel, headlights off, hands clenched, waiting for dawn. But the dark had its own patience. Around midnight, I heard it again. Not a voice this time. Breathing. It came from under the van. Long, slow exhales, wet and rattling. Each one vibrated through the frame, through the pedals, up into my bones. I pressed my boots against the floor, feeling it echo beneath me. I wanted to start the engine, to roar into the night, and leave whatever was beneath me choking in exhaust. But fear locked me still. I pictured crawling things with human faces, pressing their mouths against the undercarriage, whispering through the bolts. The breathing lasted until dawn. When I finally dared to step out, the stones were gone. All of them. The path had vanished like it had never existed. Only one remained. A single river rock sat on the hood of the van, perfectly centered, as though placed by a careful hand. On its slick surface, scratched with something sharp, was another word, stay. My legs nearly gave out beneath me. The forest didn't want me gone. It wanted me here. I thought about Harris again, the warnings, the notes, the artifacts swallowed by moss. He hadn't disappeared randomly. He'd been drawn in, step by step, the same way I was being pulled. And the worst part? Some part of me wanted to obey. I don't know if it was exhaustion or madness, but I drove deeper that day. I told myself it was to prove something, to capture evidence, to carry Harris's warnings further than he could. But really, I think I just couldn't resist the pull. The road narrowed until the trees scraped the sides of the van. Moss hung like wet hair from the branches brushing against the windshield. Every so often, I thought I saw shapes between the trunks, people, standing perfectly still, watching. When I blinked, they were gone. By evening, I found a clearing. Small, damp, ringed by cedar. It was the only place wide enough to park without branches cracking the windows. I killed the engine, and silence rushed in so hard it rang in my ears. That's when I noticed the smell. The air was thick with rot, not the usual sweet decay of leaves, but something sharper, heavier, like a carcass buried shallow, bleeding through the soil. It clung to my clothes, to my hair, until I couldn't escape it. I built no fire. I barely ate. I just sat in the van, staring through the windshield at the black wall of trees, and then through the silence came a sound I'll never forget. Knock. Not on the van, on the trees themselves, one at a time in a slow circle around the clearing. Knock, knock, knock. The sound echoed through the wood, deep and hollow, as though someone was testing each trunk. I gripped the wheel until my knuckles whitened. The circle closed tighter, knock after knock, closer and closer, until the final tree against the hood of the van thudded with that same hollow strike, and then silence again. I sat there until dawn, paralyzed, waiting for whatever came next. But when morning finally washed the clearing with light, nothing had changed. The trees were still, the ground unmarked, except for the door handle. Mud streaked across the driver's side, smeared by fingers, 4 long streaks, ending in claws of dried soil. I collapsed back into the seat, shaking so hard I thought my bones might crack. This wasn't just voices or whispers or tricks of the woods anymore. Something was trying to get in. I thought of Harris, of his notes and warnings. Maybe this was where he'd stood, on the edge of running, on the edge of being taken. Maybe this was the line that decided who left and who stayed. I swore I'd leave that day. I swore I'd find the strength to drive until the trees gave way to highway, to gas stations, to people. But even as I gripped the keys, a deeper voice inside me whispered the truth. The forest wasn't letting go. The keys dug into my palm, sharp enough to draw blood. I told myself all I had to do was twist, turn the ignition, and put miles between me and whatever waited in the cedar shadows. But my hand wouldn't move. It was like the metal of the van had become part of me, like the forest was already inside the frame, gripping my wrists, whispering, "Stay." I forced myself to break the spell. I twisted the key hard, and the engine coughed alive, loud and raw in the stillness. The sound should have felt like salvation. Instead, the trees seemed to lean closer, pressing their wet branches against the glass. I dropped it into gear and lurched forward. Gravel spat from under the tires. The road narrowed, twisting tighter than I remembered, as if the forest was rearranging itself to keep me inside. My hands trembled on the wheel, sweat soaking my back. Every turn looked the same: bark, moss, shadow. After what felt like hours, I realized the truth. I was driving in circles. The same leaning cedar, the same split boulder by the bend, the same shallow pothole filled with black water. I'd passed them 3 times already. I slammed the brakes. The van skidded, mud spattering against the windshield. My breath rasped in the silence, and then I heard it. Click, click, click. The sound of stones knocking together, drifting from the trees. Then another set, answering on the opposite side of the road. Then another. Soon the woods rang with dozens of clicks, echoing off the trunks, weaving a rhythm that had no pattern, no end. I slammed my fists against the wheel, screaming at the sound, at the trees, at the sky. My voice came back to me, warped, thinner, like the forest swallowed it before it reached the air. The clicking stopped. Silence pressed in so heavy I could hear my pulse in my skull. I shoved the van back into gear and floored it, swerving through the turns until the trees blurred into one endless smear. My headlights stayed on, though it was day, stabbing into shadows I couldn't escape. Then up ahead, something appeared in the road. A ranger. He stood in the middle of the service track, soaked through, uniform dripping dark with water. His hat shaded his face, but I didn't need to see it. I knew. Harris. I slammed the brakes, tires skidding sideways, the van screeching to a halt just feet from him. My chest hammered as I stared. He didn't move, didn't raise his hand. He just stood there, water spilling from his cuffs, dripping into the mud. I rolled the window down an inch. My throat worked to form words. Harris? His head tilted, slowly, too slowly. When he finally spoke, his voice was gravel dragged across glass. You shouldn't have listened. The air in the van turned ice cold. My breath came out in fog. Harris raised a hand, and for the first time, I saw his face. It wasn't Harris anymore. The skin sagged, moss sprouting from the corners of his mouth, eyes black as standing water. His lips peeled back into a smile far too wide, and his voice dropped lower, wet and guttural. You belong here. I slammed the window up and gunned the engine. The van roared forward, straight through the figure. For a second, resistance, like hitting water. Then nothing. The road ahead was empty. But when I glanced in the rearview mirror, Harris was there. Standing in the middle of the road, head tilted, watching me go. I drove blind, heart slamming, until the forest thinned and I broke into a clearing. I skidded to a stop, hands shaking too hard to keep control. The clearing wasn't empty. Cabins, dozens of them, arranged in a crooked half circle, their roofs sagging, windows dark. They looked abandoned, wood swollen with years of rain. But smoke curled faintly from one chimney, rising steady into the gray sky. I should have turned around. I should have left. But some thread tugged me forward, pulling me toward the one cabin that still breathed. I parked, stepped out into the damp silence. My boots sank deep into mud that smelled of iron and rot. Each step felt heavier, as though the ground was trying to claim me. The cabin door stood half open. Inside was dim, shadows shifting with the light of a single candle. And on the table, laid out as if waiting for me, was my camera. My legs buckled. I'd left it in the van. I reached for it, hands trembling, when a knock rattled the walls, 3 sharp strikes echoing like a fist against the wood. I froze. The knock came again. Not at the door, at the window, right beside me. I turned, a face pressed against the glass, my own face. The reflection smiled, teeth too white, eyes too black. Then the glass cracked, spiderwebbing out from the pressure of its forehead. I stumbled back, clutching the camera to my chest as the sound of stones began again. Click, 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 rising to a deafening chorus around the cabin. The candle blew out, darkness swallowed the room, and in the black, my own voice whispered in my ear, "Stay." The word rattled inside my skull, "Stay," spoken in my own voice, thick and wet with something that wasn't breath. I spun, slamming into the table, fumbling for any scrap of light. The camera slipped from my hands and hit the floor with a dull crack. I pawed through my pack until my fingers closed around the flashlight. The beam flared to life, slicing through the dark. The cabin was empty. The cracked window showed only trees, slick with rain, no face, no reflection, just my ragged breath bouncing back at me in the glass. But the stones kept clicking, louder now, like dozens of hands clapping rocks together in a rhythm that wasn't quite human. I pressed the flashlight to the window and nearly dropped it. They were stacked. Everywhere I looked, just beyond the clearing, small towers of river stones had appeared. Not one or two, dozens, maybe hundreds. They rose knee-high, shoulder-high, taller than me, encircling the cabin in uneven rows. Their wet surfaces gleamed in the light, catching the beam like eyes. The clicking came from them, from all of them. Stones knocking together with no hands, no wind, just sound swelling in the damp night. I backed away from the window, heart punching against my ribs. The floor creaked beneath me. For a second, I thought the cabin itself might collapse, swallowed into the mud. Then I heard the breathing again. Not outside, not beneath the van, inside the cabin. It came from the corner, just beyond the edge of the flashlight's glow, wet, ragged, rattling, as though lungs filled with moss were forcing air through rotting reeds. I swung the light toward the sound. Empty, just shadows clinging to old wood. But the breathing didn't stop. I bolted. I tore through the cabin door, into the clearing, into the suffocating stench of rot. The flashlight beam caught faces in the tree line. Not real ones, Not flesh, but patterns of bark and moss twisted into grim parodies. They seemed to lean closer when I passed. The van was still where I'd left it, streaked with mud, headlights faintly glowing like dying eyes. I flung the door open, heart hammering, and froze. The hat was back, on the driver's seat. Dry. Perfect. The name stitched inside still read Daniel. I hurled it into the mud and jammed the key into the ignition. The engine coughed, stuttered, caught. I floored the gas, tires spinning before gripping the soaked ground. The clicking followed. It chased me down the road, stone against stone echoing through the forest, keeping pace no matter how fast I drove. Every turn brought another flash of towers in the beam of my headlights, stacked along the roadside like sentinels. Then came the voices. Dozens of them. Male, female, young, old, calling from the trees. Some begged, some laughed, some sobbed, but all of them knew my name. Daniel. Stay, Daniel. Don't leave us. I pressed harder on the gas, veins burning with panic. The road twisted tighter, trees blurring past. My eyes stung with sweat and terror. Then the headlights hit something ahead. Cabins. The same crooked half circle I'd already left behind. The same clearing. I slammed the brakes, tires screaming, van skidding sideways into the mud. My chest heaved as the engine idled, the clearing staring back at me like an open mouth. No, I had driven away. I'd left this place. I couldn't have looped back. But the cabins stood there, patient, waiting. Smoke still curled from the same chimney. I screamed, slamming the van into reverse, tearing back down the road. Branches scraped the paint, rain blinded the windshield, but I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. Minutes later, the trees broke open again. The cabins. The same ones. The same sagging roofs, the same crooked windows, the same candle glow behind the cracked glass. I punched the wheel, tears burning my eyes. The forest had me caged, spinning me through its loops like a moth in a jar. The voices swelled, laughing now, high and sharp, echoing off every trunk. The clicking rose to a fever pitch, a storm of stone on stone rattling through the woods. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. I jammed the shifter into drive and aimed straight for the cabins. If the forest wanted me there, then fine. I'd burn through it, smash through walls and windows, break whatever spell kept me circling. The van roared forward. Headlights cut across wet wood, across the sagging frame of the nearest cabin. My hands locked on the wheel, eyes wide, heart breaking my ribs. And just as I hit the threshold of the clearing, the figure stepped out. Harris, dripping, grinning, eyes black as pits. I swerved, tires skidding, van careening sideways into the mud. The impact rocked me against the seatbelt, glass shattering as I slammed into a cedar trunk. The engine sputtered, coughed, died. Smoke hissed from under the hood. Silence. Then the knock. 3 deliberate strikes. Not on the van, not on the trees, on the window beside my face. I turned, slow as death, and saw myself, standing in the rain, eyes hollow, skin crawling with moss. My reflection outside the glass smiled, teeth black, hand pressed to the window, in perfect imitation of my own. The whisper came again, my own voice doubled in the dark. You belong here. My breath fogged the cracked glass. On the other side, my reflection didn't fog at all. It just stood there, grinning with those blackened teeth, hands splayed against the window like it was trying to push through. I jerked away, shoulder slamming into the passenger seat. The reflection tilted its head, mirroring me perfectly, even as my movements grew frantic. My chest hitched in shallow gasps. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but there was nowhere to go. The forest had folded itself around me, the cabins circling, the stones clicking, the voices whispering in my own tongue. I shut my eyes. For one long second, I tried to pretend it wasn't happening, that I was still parked by the service road, coffee steaming on the dash, camera catching bird song. But when I opened them, the reflection was inside. It sat in the driver's seat, head bowed, hair dripping with moss water, breath rattling through lungs that didn't work. My own face ruined. I screamed. The sound tore from my throat raw, and for the first time the forest seemed to flinch. The clicking of stones faltered. The voices stumbled. The reflection twitched, smile cracking, eyes fluttering like a candle about to snuff. I grabbed the only weapon I had, my flashlight, and smashed it into the window. Glass exploded outward, rain rushing in with a roar. The reflection shattered with it, scattering like smoke into the night. I crawled through the jagged frame, arms cut, blood mingling with rain. My boots hit the mud, and I ran. Not toward the road, not toward the cabins, but away. Straight into the trees. Branches lashed my face, roots clawed my legs, but I didn't stop. The forest howled. The stones began again, louder than thunder, a chorus of cracking rock that chased me deeper. Voices rose in overlapping waves, shouting my name, shouting Harris's, shouting things I didn't want to understand. Still I ran. I don't know how long. Time dissolved in the panic, in the pounding of blood in my ears. At some point the forest thinned, the ground sloped, and I burst out onto asphalt, a real road. I collapsed to my knees, chest heaving, rain soaking through every thread of my clothes. For a moment, I thought it was another trick, that the trees would fold back over me, that the road would twist into another loop. But when headlights flared in the distance, bright and solid, I knew. A truck slowed, brakes hissing, window rolling down. A woman's voice called out, sharp with concern. "Hey, you all right?" I couldn't answer. My voice had burned out in the scream. I just staggered forward, blood running from glass cuts, rain plastering my hair to my face. She opened the door, helped me climb inside, muttering curses at the state of me. We drove. Away from the forest, away from the cabins, away from Harris. The farther we went, the quieter my head became. The clicking faded. The voices dimmed. For the first time in days, I let my eyes close. I woke in a ranger station. Warm light. Coffee steaming. A blanket around my shoulders. The ranger across the table looked at me with careful eyes. He asked the usual questions, name, age, where I'd been. I answered in a hollow voice, words spilling out like broken glass. When I mentioned Harris, the ranger froze. His lips pressed tight before he finally shook his head. Harris went missing 12 years ago. The room tilted. They tried to tell me it was shock, exposure, that the forest can bend a man's mind if he spends too long alone. They bandaged my cuts, handed me back my camera, told me to get rest. But when I was alone, I powered the camera on. The footage was still there. Not of me. Not of the van. Of Harris. He sat at a table in the same cabin I'd stumbled into. His face was pale, eyes sunk deep, voice a hoarse whisper as he spoke into the lens. "They want names," he rasped. "That's how they hold you. Don't let them stitch it into the forest. Don't let them write it down. If they have your name, they have you. Don't listen. Don't answer. Don't." The screen cut to static. I dropped the camera, heart stuttering. The ranger's words, Harris's warnings, the hat, the badge, the stones, it all tangled into one truth I couldn't deny. The forest hadn't just wanted Harris, it wanted me. It wanted anyone who listened long enough, who stayed long enough, who let their name slip through the branches. And though I escaped, though asphalt carried me out, I know I didn't leave it behind. Because sometimes, late at night, parked in some quiet campground miles from anywhere, click, 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 and then my own voice whispering just outside the van, "Stay."